Welcome back to A People's Historian, the show where we read about 30 minutes of history together. My name is Jason Kishinev, and we are reading Chapter 4 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, talking about the circumstances that led to the Revolutionary War. And remember, if you like the episode, you know what to do. Let's dig in. Impressment was the background of the Boston Massacre. And we're talking about the British forcing American colonists to be British soldiers. There had been impressment riots through the 1760s in New York and in Newport, Rhode Island, where 500 seamen, boys, and Negroes rioted after 5 weeks of impressment by the British. 6 weeks before the Boston Massacre, there was a battle in New York of seamen against British soldiers taking their jobs, and one seaman was killed. In the Boston Tea Party of December 1773, the Boston Committee of Correspondence, formed a year before to organize anti-British actions, controlled crowd action and against the tea from the start. I don't know why I got the word "and" in there. Controlled crowd action against the tea from the start, Dirk says. The Tea Party led to the coercive acts by Parliament, virtually establishing martial law in Massachusetts, dissolving the colonial government, closing the port in Boston, and sending in troops. Still, town meetings and mass meetings rose in opposition. The seizure of a powder store by the British led 4,000 men from all around Boston to assemble in Cambridge, where some of the wealthy officials had their sumptuous homes. The crowd forced the officials to resign. The committees of correspondence of Boston and other towns welcomed this gathering, but warned against destroying private property. Pauline Maier, who studied the development of opposition to Britain in the decade before 1776, in her book, From Resistance to Revolution, emphasizes the moderation of the leadership, and despite their desire for resistance, their emphasis on order and restraint. She notes, the officers and committee members of the Sons of Liberty were drawn almost entirely from the middle and upper classes of colonial society. In Newport, Rhode Island, for instance, the Sons of Liberty, according to a contemporary writer, contained some gentlemen of the first figure in town for opulence, sense, and politeness. In North Carolina, one of the wealthiest of the gentlemen and freeholders led the Sons of Liberty. Similarly, in Virginia and South Carolina, and New York's leaders too were involved in small but respectable independent business ventures. Their aim, however, was to broaden their organization, to develop a mass base of wage earners. Many of the Sons of Liberty groups declared, as in Milford, Connecticut, their greatest abhorrence of lawlessness, or as in Annapolis, opposed all riots or unlawful assemblies tending to the disturbance of the public tranquility. John Adams expressed the same fears. These tarrings and featherings, this breaking open houses by rude and insolent rabbles in resentment for private wrongs or in pursuing of private prejudices and passions, must be discountenanced. In Virginia, it seemed clear to the educated gentry that something needed to be done to persuade the lower orders to join the revolutionary cause, to deflect their anger against England. One Virginian wrote in his diary in the spring of 1774, "The lower class of people here are in tumult on account of reports from Boston. Many of them expect to be pressed and compelled to go and fight the Britons." Around the time of the Stamp Act, a Virginia orator addressed the poor. "Are not the gentlemen made of the same materials as the lowest and poorest among you? Listen to no doctrines which may tend to divide us, but let us go hand in hand as brothers." It was a problem for which the rhetorical talents of Patrick Henry were superbly fitted. He was, as Rise Isaac puts it, firmly attached to the world of the gentry, but he spoke in words that the poorer whites of Virginia could understand. Henry's fellow Virginian Edmund Randolph recalled his style as simplicity and even carelessness. His pauses, for which their length might sometimes be feared to dispel the attention, riveted it the more by raising the expectation. Patrick Henry's oratory in Virginia pointed a way to relieve class tension between upper and lower classes and form a bond against the British. This was to find language inspiring to all classes, specific enough in its listing of grievances to charge people with anger against the British, vague enough to avoid class conflict among the rebels, and stirring enough to build patriotic feeling for the resistance movement. Tom Paine's Common Sense, which appeared in early 1776 and became the most popular pamphlet in the American colonies, did this. It made the first bold argument for independence in words that any fairly literate person could understand. Society in every state is a blessing, but government, even in its best state, is but a necessary evil. Paine disposed of the idea of the divine right of kings by a pungent history of the British monarchy going back to the Norman conquest of 1066, when William the Conqueror came over from France to set himself on the British throne. A French bastard landing with an armed banditti and establishing himself King of England against the consent of the natives is in plain terms a very paltry, rascally origin. It certainly hath no divinity in it. Paine dealt with the practical advantages of sticking to England or being separated. He knew the importance of economics. I challenge the warmest advocate for reconciliation to show a single advantage that this continent can reap by being connected with Great Britain. I repeat the challenge. Not a single advantage is derived. Our corn will fetch its price in any market in Europe, and our imported goods must be paid for by them where we will. As for the bad effects of the connection with England, Paine appealed to the colonists' memory of all wars in which England had involved them, wars costly in lives and money. But the injuries and disadvantages which we sustain by that connection are without number. Any submission to or dependence on Great Britain tends directly to involve this continent in European wars and quarrels, and sets us at variance with nations who would otherwise seek our friendship. He built slowly to an emotional pitch. Everything that is right or reasonable pleads for separation. The blood of the slain, the weeping voice of nature cries, "'Tis time to part." Common Sense went through 25 editions in 1776 and sold hundreds of thousands of copies. And that's a lot of copies for 1776. It is probable that almost every literate colonist either read it or knew about its contents. Pamphleteering had become, by this time, the chief theater of debate about relations with England. From 1750 to 1776, 400 pamphlets had appeared arguing one or another side of the Stamp Act, or the Boston Massacre, or the Tea Party, or the general questions of disobedience to law, loyalty to the government, rights and obligations. Paine's pamphlet appealed to a wide range of colonial opinion angered by England, but it caused some tremors in aristocrats like John Adams, who were with the patriot cause but wanted to make sure it didn't go too far in the direction of democracy. Paine had denounced the so-called balanced government of lords and commons as a deception, and called for single-chamber representative bodies where the people could be represented. Adams denounced Paine's plan as so democratical without any restraint or even an attempt at an equilibrium or counterpoise that it must produce confusion and every evil work. Popular assemblies needed to be checked, Adams thought, because they were productive of hasty results and absurd judgments. Paine himself came out of the lower orders of England, a staymaker, tax official, teacher, poor immigrant to America. He arrived in Philadelphia in 1774 when agitation against England was already strong in the colonies. The artisan mechanics of Philadelphia, along with journeymen, apprentices, and ordinary laborers, were forming into a politically conscious militia. In general, damned riffraff, dirty, mutinous, and disaffected, as loyal aristocrats described them. That's a good description. Good description. By speaking plainly and strongly, he could represent those politically conscious lower-class people. He opposed property qualifications for voting in Pennsylvania, but his great concern seems to have been to speak for a middle group. There is an extent of riches as well as an extreme of poverty which, by harrowing the circles of a man's acquaintance, lessens his opportunities of general knowledge. Once the revolution was underway, Paine more and more made it clear that he was not for the crowd action of lower-class people, like those militia who in 1779 attacked the house of James Wilson. Wilson was a revolutionary leader who opposed price controls and wanted a more conservative government than was given by the Pennsylvania Constitution of 1776. Paine became an associate of one of the wealthiest men in Pennsylvania, Robert Morris, and a supporter of Morris's creation, the Bank of North America. Later, during the controversy over adopting the Constitution, Paine would once again represent urban artisans who favored a strong central government. He seemed to believe that such a government could represent some great common interest. In this sense, he lent himself perfectly to the myth of the revolution, that it was on behalf of a united people. The Declaration of Independence brought that myth to its peak of eloquence. Each harsher measure of British control, the proclamation of 1763 not allowing colonists to settle beyond the Appalachians, the Stamp Act, the Townshend taxes, including the one on tea, the stationing of troops and the Boston Massacre, the closing of the port of Boston, and the dissolution of the Boston legislature escalated colonial rebellion to the point of revolution. The colonists had responded with the Stamp Act Congress. The Sons of Liberty, the Committees of Correspondence, the Boston Tea Party, and finally, in 1774, the setting up of a Continental Congress, an illegal body, forerunner of a future independent government. It was after the military clash at Lexington and Concord in April 1775 between colonial Minutemen and British troops that the Continental Congress decided on separation. They organized a small committee to draw up the Declaration of Independence, which Thomas Jefferson wrote. It was adopted by the Congress on July 2nd and officially proclaimed July 4th, 1776. As I hope you know. By this time, there was already a powerful sentiment for independence. Resolutions adopted in North Carolina in May of 1776 and sent to the Continental Congress declared independence of England, asserted that all British law was null and void, and urged military preparations. About the same time, the town of Malden, Massachusetts, responding to a request from the Massachusetts House of Representatives that all towns in the state declare their views on independence, had met in town meeting and unanimously called for independence. We therefore renounce with disdain our connection with the kingdom of slaves. We bid a final adieu to Britain. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands, they should declare the causes. This was the opening of the Declaration of Independence. Then in its second paragraph came the powerful philosophical statement. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government. It then went on to list grievances against the king, a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. The list accused the king of dissolving colonial governments, controlling judges, sending swarms of officers to harass our people, sending in armies of occupation, cutting off colonial trade with other parts of the world, taxing the colonists without their consent, and waging war against them, transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny. All this, the language of popular control over governments, the right of rebellion and revolution, indignation at political tyranny, economic burdens, and military attacks, was language well suited to unite large numbers of colonists and persuade even those who had grievances against one another to turn against England. Some Americans were clearly omitted from this circle of united interest drawn by the Declaration of Independence. You know who they are: Indians, black slaves, women. Indeed, one paragraph of the Declaration charged the king with inciting slave rebellions and Indian attacks. He has excited domestic insurrections among us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. "20 years before the Declaration, a proclamation of the Legislature of Massachusetts of November 3rd, 1755, declared the Penobscot Indians rebels, enemies, and traitors, and provided a bounty for every scalp of a male Indian brought in, 40 pounds. For every scalp of such female Indian or male Indian under the age of 12 years that shall be killed, 20 pounds. Thomas Jefferson had written a paragraph of the Declaration accusing the king of transporting slaves from Africa to the colonies and suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or to restrain this execrable commerce. This seemed to express moral indignation against slavery and the slave trade. Jefferson's personal distaste for slavery must be put alongside the fact that he owned hundreds of slaves to the day he died. Behind it was the growing fear among Virginians and some other Southerners about the growing number of black slaves in the colonies, 20% of the total population, and the threat of slave revolts as the number of slaves increased. Jefferson's paragraph was removed by the Continental Congress because slaveholders themselves disagreed about the desirability of ending the slave trade. So even that gesture toward the black slave was omitted in the great manifesto of freedom of the American Revolution. The use of the phrase, "all men are created equal," was probably not a deliberate attempt to make a statement about women. It was just that women were beyond consideration as worthy of inclusion. They were politically invisible, though practical needs gave women a certain authority in the home, on the farm, or in occupations like midwifery. They were simply overlooked in any consideration of political rights, any notions of civic equality. To say that the Declaration of Independence, even by its own language, was limited to life, liberty, and happiness for white males is not to denounce the makers and signers of the Declaration for holding the ideas expected of privileged males of the 18th century. Reformers and radicals looking discontentedly at history are often accused of expecting too much from a past political epoch, and sometimes they do. But the point of noting those outside the arc of human rights in the Declaration is not, centuries late and pointlessly, to lay impossible moral burdens on that time. It is try to understand the way in which the Declaration functioned to mobilize certain groups of Americans, ignoring others. Surely inspirational language to create a secure consensus is still used in our time to cover up serious conflicts of interest in that consensus, and to cover up also the omission of large parts of the human race. The philosophy of the Declaration: the government is set up by the people to secure their life, liberty, and happiness, and is to be overthrown when it no longer does that, is often traced to the ideas of John Locke in his second treatise on government. That was published in England in 1689, when the English were rebelling against tyrannical kings and setting up parliamentary government. The Declaration, like Locke's second treatise, talked about government and political rights, but ignored the existing inequalities in property. And how could people truly have equal rights with stark differences in wealth? Locke himself was a wealthy man, with investments in the silk trade and slave trade, income from loans and mortgages. He invested heavily in the first issue of the stock of the Bank of England just a few years after it had written the second treatise, after he had written the second treatise as the classic statement of liberal democracy. As advisor to the Carolinas, he had suggested a government of slave owners run by wealthy land barons. Locke's statement of people's government was in support of a revolution in England for the free development of mercantile capitalism, at home and abroad. Locke himself regretted that the labor of poor children is generally lost to the public till they are 12 or 14 years old, and suggested that all children over 3 of families on relief should attend working schools, so they would be from infancy inured to work. The English revolutions of the 17th century brought representative government and opened up discussions of democracy. But as the English historian Christopher Hill wrote in The Puritan Revolution, the establishment of parliamentary supremacy, of the rule of law, no doubt mainly benefited the men of property. The kind of arbitrary taxation that threatened the security of property was overthrown. Monopolies were ended to give more free rein to businesses, and sea power began to be used for an imperial policy abroad, including the conquest of Ireland. The levelers and the diggers Two political movements which wanted to carry equality into the economic sphere were put down by the revolution. One can see the reality of Locke's nice phrases about representative government in the class divisions and conflicts in England that followed the revolution that Locke supported. At the very time the American scene was becoming tense, in 1768, England was racked by riots and strikes of coal heavers, sawmill workers, hatters, weavers, sailors, because of the high price of bread and the miserable wages. The Annual Register reviewed the events of the spring and summer of 1768. A general dissatisfaction unhappily prevailed among several of the lower orders of the people. This ill temper, which was partly occasioned by the high price of provisions and partly proceeded from other causes, too frequently manifested itself in acts of tumult and riot, which were productive of the most melancholy consequences. The people, who were supposedly at the heart of Locke's theory of people's sovereignty, were defined by a British member of Parliament. I don't mean the mob. I mean the middling people of England, the manufacturer, the yeoman, the merchant, the country gentleman. In America, too, the reality behind the words of the Declaration of Independence, issued in the same year as Adam Smith's capitalist manifesto, The Wealth of Nations, was that a rising class of important people needed to enlist on their side enough Americans to defeat England without disturbing too much the relations of wealth and power that had developed over 150 years of colonial history. Indeed, 69% of the signers of the Declaration of Independence had held colonial office under England. When the Declaration of Independence was read, with all its flaming radical language, from the town hall balcony in Boston, it was read by Thomas Crafts, a member of the Loyal Nine group, conservatives who had opposed militant action against the British. 4 days after the reading, the Boston Committee of Correspondence ordered the townsmen to show up on the common for a military draft. The rich, it turned out, could avoid the draft by paying for substitutes. The poor had to serve. This led to rioting and shouting, "Tyranny is tyranny, let it come from who it may." Thank you for joining me. I hope you tune in next time. Hit that like and subscribe button, and we'll see you.